Jacob was born into a home marked by promises and tensions. He was the son of Isaac, the heir of a covenant that came directly from God, and of Rebekah, a woman of faith, but who carried concerns in her heart. From the womb, Jacob already showed that he would not be a common character in history. While still growing in his mother's womb, he and his twin brother Esau fought as if their lives depended on it. What could be just a natural movement took on another meaning when God revealed to Rebekah that two peoples were in her womb, and the younger would prevail over the older, a foreshadowing that things would never be simple for Jacob. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. The day of birth was a scene full of symbolism. Esau, the firstborn, came first, covered in reddish hair that gave him a savage appearance. But Jacob followed closely behind, holding his brother's heel tightly, as if unwilling to be left behind. It was as if, at that moment, he already demonstrated his determined and restless nature. The name Jacob was born from this scene, carrying the weight of meaning, both he who grasps the heel and deceiver. Growing up as the youngest son, in a time when birthright meant power and privilege, shaped Jacob in profound ways. He always knew that on paper, everything belonged to Esau: the inheritance, the blessing, the recognition. But there was something in Jacob that didn't conform to this. While Esau became Isaac's favorite hunter, Jacob remained closer to the tents, gaining Rebekah's attention and affection. The tension between Jacob and Esau was not just a matter of personality differences. It was something deeper, as if God's promise to Rebekah, the one about the youngest dominating the oldest, hung over them like an invisible shadow. Jacob, always observant and strategic, noticed something that could change his destiny. One day, as Esau returned from hunting hungry and exhausted, he came across Jacob, who was cooking lentil stew. The smell of the hot, aromatic stew filled the air, and Esau, without thinking twice, asked for some. But Jacob, who rarely let an opportunity pass by, saw the chance he had been waiting for. "First, sell me your birthright," he said, with an almost disconcerting calm. Esau, guided more by his stomach than by reason, scoffed at the idea. "What good is my birthright if I'm on the verge of death?" he replied dramatically. Thus, in a thoughtless and hasty act, Esau swore his birthright to Jacob, exchanging it for a simple dish of lentils. The moment seemed small, almost insignificant, but it carried powerful symbolism. Esau, the natural heir, despised what was most valuable, while Jacob, even controversially, took possession of the future he so desired. But that was just the beginning. The father's great blessing, the one that would guarantee divine favor and leadership of the family, was still at stake. Isaac was already old, his vision weakened by time, and he knew that the time to bless his eldest son was approaching. Esau, confident, suspected nothing. However, Rebekah, always attentive, heard Isaac's plan and decided to intervene. His heart was determined. The blessing had to be Jacob's, no matter what the cost. Rebekah wasted no time. As soon as he learned that Isaac planned to bless Esau, he secretly called Jacob. There was a rush and tension in his voice as he explained what needed to be done. Isaac had asked Esau to go to the field to hunt and prepare a special dish before receiving the blessing. Rebekah knew that this was the opportunity to act. "Go get 2 goats from the flock," she said to Jacob. "I myself will prepare the dish your father likes. You will take it to him and receive the blessing in Esau's place." Jacob hesitated. He wasn't like his brother. Esau was hairy and had a deep voice, while he had smooth skin and a softer timbre. How would he deceive his own father? "If he touches me, he will discover the truth, and instead of a blessing, I will bring a curse upon myself," he argued. But Rebekah was determined. She took Esau's clothes, which gave off the smell of hunting and fields, and put them on Jacob. To imitate his brother's rough skin, she covered his hands and neck with goat skins. Every detail was carefully thought out. With the plate in his hands, Jacob entered Isaac's tent. His heart seemed to be beating so hard that he was afraid his father would hear it. "My father," he said, trying to imitate Esau's voice. Isaac, already suspicious, asked, "How did you find the game so quickly, my son?" Jacob responded quickly, attributing the feat to God's help. But Isaac was still in doubt. She called him closer and touched his fur-covered hands. "The voice is Jacob's, but the hands are Esau's," he murmured. After a moment of hesitation, Isaac relented. He ate the prepared dish, blessed Jacob with words that echoed for generations, guaranteeing him abundance, dominion, and divine blessing. But as soon as Jacob left, the sound of footsteps on the horizon sent a chill down my spine. Esau was returning, with the plate in his hands and expectation on his face. When Esau entered Isaac's tent, still holding the carefully prepared dish, he had the expression on his face of someone who was waiting for a triumphant moment. "My father, arise and eat of your son's game, that he may bless me," he said confidently. But Isaac, surprised and confused, asked, "Who are you?" The question paralyzed Esau for a moment. "It is I, Esau, your firstborn," he replied, without understanding what was happening. It was then that the truth began to reveal itself like thunder on a clear day. Isaac trembled with astonishment. "Who was it then that brought the game before you? I have eaten everything, and I have already blessed him. And he will be blessed." Isaac's words fell like a sword into Esau's heart. The scream he gave was soul-shattering, a mixture of pain and anger. "Bless me too, my father," he begged, but Isaac could not undo what had been done. The blessing had already been given, and it was irrevocable. Esau left the tent with a look full of hatred. He could not accept what he had lost, and began to harbor a desire for revenge in his heart. "The days of mourning for my father are near. After that I will kill Jacob," he thought, letting those around him reveal his plan. Rebekah, upon hearing these words, knew she needed to act quickly to protect Jacob. She called her youngest son and explained the seriousness of the situation. "Your brother is furious and wants to take your life. You must flee to my brother Laban's house in Haran. Stay there until Esau's anger passes." With a heavy heart, Jacob prepared to leave. Before he went to his father, who, without knowing Rebekah's plan, gave him another blessing, sending him away in peace. That night, with fear and uncertainty, Jacob began his journey. But what he didn't know is that God had something extraordinary in store for him along the way. Jacob's journey was long and lonely. With each step, he moved further from the home he knew and closer to an uncertain future. The weight of guilt and fear of what could happen followed him like a shadow. He knew Esau was furious, and distance was the only thing keeping him safe. During the day, the desert heat exhausted him. At night, the cold seemed to amplify the loneliness. It was on one of these nights, while looking for a place to rest, that something extraordinary happened. Jacob chose a stone as a pillow and lay down under the starry sky. The silence around him was profound, but his mind was full of thoughts. He fell asleep, and then a dream changed everything. He saw a ladder extending from earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending on it. At the top of the ladder stood God himself. The vision was of indescribable beauty, and Jacob remained motionless, caught up in what he saw. God spoke to him, reaffirming the promise made to Abraham and Isaac. "I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give the land on which you lie to you and your descendants. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth. They will spread to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. In you and in your descendants all the families of the earth will be blessed." But what touched Jacob even more deeply was the promise of care. "I am with you and will keep you wherever you go." Jacob woke up with his heart racing. He knew this place was special. He called it Bethel, which means house of God, and made a vow. He promised that if God fulfilled his words, he too would be faithful. With his soul strengthened by that vision, Jacob continued his journey. The path ahead was still uncertain, but something within him was beginning to change. After days of walking, Jacob finally arrived at his uncle Laban's land. Tired but hopeful, he saw a well where some shepherds were gathered. He asked them about Laban and discovered that he was not far away. While they were talking, something unexpected happened. A young woman approached, leading a herd. It was Rachel, daughter of Laban. Jacob felt his heart beat faster. Maybe it was the tiredness of the journey or the sweetness in her eyes. But at that moment, something changed inside him. With a strength that seemed to come from an unexpected impulse, Jacob removed the heavy stone that covered the well to help Rachel water the sheep. Then, without hesitation, he introduced himself and told us who he was. Rachel, surprised and delighted, ran to tell her father the news. Laban, upon hearing that his nephew had arrived, ran to welcome him with joy. He hugged Jacob as if he had found a part of himself again and took him to his home. Jacob went to work for Laban, taking care of the flocks. He was dedicated, diligent, and, above all, motivated by a growing feeling for Rachel. After a while, Laban asked him what salary he wanted for his work. Jacob, without hesitation, said he would work 7 years to marry Rachel. Laban agreed, and Jacob threw himself into the work with enthusiasm. 7 years seemed like a few days. Such was his passion for her. Finally, the wedding day arrived. The celebration was grand, full of joy and expectation. But when night fell, Laban plotted something that Jacob could never imagine. Under the heavy veil of tradition and shadows, Laban gave Leah, Rachel's older sister, as Jacob's wife. Jacob woke up that morning with a mixture of astonishment and outrage. When he realized that he had married Leah and not Rachel, he felt betrayed in a way he never imagined. He went to Laban looking for answers. "What did you do to me?" he asked, his voice full of disbelief. "I worked 7 years for Rachel. Why did you deceive me?" Laban, with a calmness that seemed rehearsed, explained that in his land it was not customary to marry the youngest daughter before the oldest. "Complete the wedding week with Leah, and then I will also give you Rachel, but on one condition: work for me for another 7 years. Jacob, despite being upset, agreed. His love for Rachel was greater than his frustration, and he knew he couldn't go back. He began to live with his 2 sisters, but the situation was far from harmonious. Leah, knowing that she was not the favorite, lived in search of recognition and love. On the other hand, Rachel, although loved, faced the pain of not being able to have children. Each of them dealt with the complexity of that relationship in different ways, and Jacob was at the center of it all. As time passed, Leah gave birth to several children, each birth carrying deep meanings. Each name she chose seemed like a plea or a declaration about her life. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. Rachel, in turn, seeing herself at a disadvantage, gave her servant Bilhah as a wife to Jacob, and 2 more sons were born. Leah, not wanting to be left behind, did the same with her servant Zilpah, expanding the family even further. Jacob's house was filled with children, but also with disputes and rivalries. And in the midst of it all, God looked at Rachel and heard her cry. She finally conceived and gave birth to a son whom she named Joseph. This birth brought new joy to Jacob. The years passed, and Jacob became a prosperous man. His herds multiplied, and his family grew impressively. But the relationship with Laban, his father-in-law, began to deteriorate. Laban, envious of Jacob's success, looked for ways to harm him by constantly changing the terms of his work. Every time Jacob found a way to prosper, Laban changed the conditions, trying to deceive him and reduce his wealth. But with each attempt, God blessed Jacob, and he became stronger. And it was in this scenario of rivalry that a restlessness took over Jacob. He felt that the time had come to leave Laban's lands and return to his homeland. God had spoken to him, telling him it was time to return to his father's house. With a divided heart, Jacob shared his plans with his wives, Rachel and Leah. The two, with complex feelings about the match, agreed, but tensions were evident. Rachel, for example, felt a strong attachment to the place where she grew up and to her father, but she knew that obedience to God and love for Jacob was stronger. The decision was made, and Jacob prepared his departure in secret. When Laban went out to shear the sheep, Jacob took his family and possessions and left without warning. But Rachel, in a move that Jacob may never have fully understood, stole her father's idols. When Laban learned that Jacob had fled, his anger was immense. He chased his son-in-law for several days until he caught up with him. The confrontation was inevitable, and the words exchanged between them became a reminder that not every journey is smooth. But what Laban didn't know was that God had appeared to him in a dream and warned him not to harm Jacob. When the reunion took place, a pact was made, sealing the end of the persecution, but also the beginning of a new chapter in the life of Jacob, who now found himself facing a great challenge, returning to his homeland and confronting the brother he feared so much. With the pact made between Jacob and Laban, the tension with his father-in-law was finally behind him, but a much greater fear now dominated Jacob's heart. He knew that his return meant an inevitable encounter with Esau, the brother who had sworn revenge. The years that passed did not erase the memory of that day when Jacob stole his blessing. What would Esau do now? Would you still hate him? Was it waiting, armed and ready to attack? These thoughts gave him no peace as he guided his caravan along the long road back. To try to calm the situation, Jacob decided to send messengers to Esau. He instructed them to carry a humble message, calling Esau my lord, and himself your servant. Jacob also prepared an impressive gift: flocks of sheep, goats, camels, cows, and donkeys, all carefully separated into groups to be sent one after the other. He hoped that upon seeing such generosity, Esau's heart would calm. But when the messengers returned, their words brought even more unrest. Esau is coming to meet you, and 400 men with him. Jacob's blood ran cold. 400 men were not a simple welcoming committee. It was an armed force, and he knew what that could mean. Gripped by fear, Jacob divided his people and possessions into two groups, thinking that if one was attacked, the other could escape. That night, alone and distressed, Jacob prostrated himself before God in prayer. He reminded God of the promise made at Bethel, to protect and multiply him. He asked for release and, through tears, confessed his fear. But before the sun rose, something even more extraordinary happened. A mysterious man appeared, and Jacob, instead of running away, clung to him. The fight that began in the dark of night seemed to have no end. Jacob, already tired from the long journey and with the weight of fear on his shoulders, found strength that he himself did not know he possessed. He held on to the mysterious man with all his energy, as if his very life depended on it. No words were exchanged at first, just the sound of fighting, footsteps on dry earth and heavy breathing that echoed in the solitude. As dawn began to break, the man touched the joint in Jacob's thigh, and it immediately dislocated. The pain was sharp, but Jacob didn't let go. On the contrary, he tightened his grip on his opponent, determined not to let him go. It was then that, in a voice that seemed to mix authority and mystery, the man said, "Let me go, for the day has already broken." But Jacob, wounded and exhausted, replied firmly, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." It was at that moment that everything changed. The man, who Jacob soon realized was no simple traveler, asked, "What is your name?" And Jacob, as if admitting something deeper than a mere name, replied, "Jacob." The man then declared, "Your name will no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men, and have prevailed." And there, with the sun rising over him, limping because of his leg, Jacob received a new identity. He was no longer the deceiver. Now he was the man who fought with God and was transformed. Soon after, Jacob saw Esau approaching with his men. He bowed 7 times to the ground as his heart beat wildly. But to his surprise, Esau ran to meet him, not with weapons in hand, but with tears in his eyes. They embraced, and years of hatred and fear were undone in that instant. The following years brought new joys and challenges. Jacob watched his family grow and faced painful losses, but he never forgot the moments when God intervened in his life. Every struggle and every blessing taught something profound, leaving lessons that still echo through the generations. Jacob's last years were lived with the serenity of someone who has faced the most intense storms. After the emotional reunion with Esau, he continued his journey, taking his place in the land that God had promised to his ancestors. But Jacob's life was never without challenges. He mourned the loss of his beloved Rachel, who died giving birth to Benjamin, the last of his 12 children. He carried his grief with the strength of someone who already knew the weight of goodbyes, but also with the faith that God was still at his side. Among the children, Joseph stood out as Jacob's favorite, and this generated jealousy between the brothers, triggering painful events that would mark the family's life. When Jacob believed that Joseph had been killed by a wild beast, his heart broke into pieces. He spent years carrying the grief of a father who lost his dearest son, without knowing that in Egypt, Joseph was alive and destined to save the lives of his entire family. Years later, when famine struck the land, Jacob discovered the truth. Joseph was not only alive, but he had become a powerful man in Egypt. Reuniting with his son was one of the most emotional moments of his life. There, in Egypt, Jacob lived his last years surrounded by his children and grandchildren, seeing with his own eyes the fulfillment of God's promises. He blessed each of his children before he died, leaving words that resonated for generations. He was buried in Canaan next to his parents in sacred land. The story of Jacob teaches us that life is not a straight line. It is made of struggles, mistakes, and losses, but also of reconciliations, love, and grace. Jacob reminds us that even in the midst of chaos, God is present, shaping our character and leading us to something greater than we can imagine. With each stumble, with each victory, we learn that God's promises do not fail, and He walks with us, transforming our history into something eternal. If you liked Jacob's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.